Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this opening plenary for our very special seminar of the National Human Rights Institutions. In a way, we are opening the European Development Days because I think we're about the first event, and I'm very pleased to see the large turnout. These are my first European Development Days, and I must say it's a remarkable setup. It is a fantastic venue for networking, information exchange, talking in the corridors and so on. So we are absolutely delighted, of course, that so many have turned up. But first and foremost, to focus on our event here at hand, I'm very, very pleased to be opening this plenary session of our very special seminar, which is in a way a flagship event in the context of the European Development Days, I'd say. Before we start, I should also make a practical announcement, which is indeed that in terms of interpretation, you'll find that there's simultaneous interpretation, English, French and Spanish. English is on channel 4, French is on channel 5, and Spanish is on channel 6. On behalf of the Commission, I'd also very much like to thank the International Coordinating Committee, the ICC, of the National Human Rights Institutions, as well as the 4 regional networks for the excellent cooperation we've had in co-organising this event. This is the first ever event we do of this kind, with the Commission as a co-host, organised with the National Human Rights Institutes from all over the world. We've invited all those institutions with A and B status, in line with the Paris Principles, and we're very pleased that we have reached the watermark of about 100 institutions here today, which is quite an achievement. You've travelled from far, from all over the world, which is in itself a sign of your commitment to your activities. And that's one of the reasons why we think this is quite a unique event in many ways. And the reason why we're hosting it is, of course, also that we wanted to demonstrate in a visible way our strong support and our commitment for all the work you are doing around the world, protecting and promoting human rights, which deserve visibility and awareness, and that's partly what we hope this event will do as well, because you're the ones who help make the application of human rights on the ground a reality. We're also very pleased to see that so many others have signed up from different areas who are actively involved in the human rights world, be it from the member states and other administrations, as well as UN bodies and institutions, agencies and academia and think tanks and aid agencies. So I think that shows the width and breadth of the stakeholders we have involved in this subject. So your presence today in this particular seminar, as well as over the next few days, will be absolutely crucial in order to ensure that we have a interactive and dynamic debate on issues of concern to all of us. The European Development Days are a remarkable opportunity, and I know that many of you will be having lots and lots of meetings in the margins to pick up on various issues. We're also, of course, meeting at a crucial moment when world leaders and development stakeholders are discussing the post-2015 Agenda for Development and the future sustainable development goals. And I hope we'll have a good debate on these issues, because we all know that the national human rights institutions should have a major role in implementing the future SDGs, which will become our reference point for all the work on our future agenda. And I was very pleased to learn as well that the outcome of these discussions will feed into the work plan that the International Coordinating Committee is doing on the SDGs. So there's a practical outcome, as your remarks and observations will also feed into a broader debate that will continue. Now, before we move on to the panelists, just a couple of points I'd like to share with you. As you know, the EU is very firmly committed to advance and to promote human rights and democracy. This is part of our foundation, of the EU's foundation, as spelled out in the treaty, which clearly reaffirms that the EU's external action is grounded in democracy, rule of law, universality and the indivisibility of human rights. In addition to that, we also have the EU's development policy framework, which is enshrined in the Agenda for Change and based on two pillars, namely democracy, human rights and good governance on the one hand, and inclusive and sustainable growth for human development on the other hand. The Agenda for Change is based on the idea that development and governance are not opposed, but they should be seen as complementary. And our commitment to move towards a rights-based approach encompassing all human rights for EU development is an attempt to translate those ideas into reality. At the same time, we also think that a rights-based approach is a step forward in terms of providing good quality development assistance. Within the EU, which is an equally important point, all these key principles are enshrined in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which became legally binding in 2009 at the time of entry into force of Lisbon. So the Charter is giving us the legal framework to uphold fundamental freedom and rights, reflecting our common values and our constitutional heritage in the EU. And part of the Charter, which applies to the EU, is that all our legislation, all our proposals have to be vetted for compliance with the Charter, and the Charter applies to all activities of the EU and their member states when they implement EU law. They have to abide by the Charter. And you may have noticed that the new Commission, when it took office last year, made a point out of repeating their strong commitment to ensuring the efficient human rights protection based on the Charter and ensuring that the Charter is fully implemented, which is of course the other side of it. So in the EU we see that the European Union Court increasingly refers to the Charter in its judgments, which is a good sign and shows that we are building a coherent legal system for the protection of fundamental rights. We still have work to do, partly because a recent Eurobarometer poll showed that while 65% of European citizens have heard about the Charter, very few actually know what's in it and what it does for them. And I think that more generally also shows the importance of awareness-raising campaigns. And of course, it's also part of the role of the human rights institutions in Europe, in this case, to play a role in facilitating a better awareness and understanding of where to turn when fundamental rights are at stake. And as you know, there are 15 of the member states of the EU who are in the A status category for the national human rights institutions. Now, secondly, the EU is a very, very strong supporter of establishing and of the good functioning of independent national human rights institutions in compliance with the Paris Principles. And in fact, this event takes place at a time when the European Union is, in a very practical way, strengthening both its political and its financial support for the national institutes. This means that we have recently, the Commission and the European External Action Service adopted a proposal for an EU action plan on human rights and democracy, covering the period 2015-2019, replacing an older one, and this new proposal is now being discussed in the Council. But what's of interest to you is perhaps that it actually lists as its first priority the support to the capacity of national human rights institutions. This is a way of recognizing their role in an independent way and trying to engage with these institutions involve them more extensively in the consultation process when it takes place at national level, and generally seeking to strengthen the capacities of institutions in order to play a more active role and in order to upgrade when necessary. So apart from this strong signal in the future action plan of the EU, we are also making practical efforts at the level of financing. And while we have over the years already financed a number of projects, be it specific or more general to provide support for the national human rights institutions, we have now, under our new financial framework, in the instrument that particularly concerns your area, namely the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, a specific mention that is aimed at supporting national human rights institutions in the financial period ahead. And to translate this into practice, we have in fact a new programme of €5 million, which will aim to strengthen the capacity of global and regional networks of the institutions in the field of economic, social and cultural rights, as well as business and human rights more generally. And this will be launched shortly after this event. So I think these two factors taken together, that the institutions are a priority, actually the first objective in our future action plan, combined with the financial support, shows our strong backing for all the work you do. Why are we doing this now? Now, partly we have the European Development Days, but also this is the European Year of Development, which is the first time there's been such a year devoted to EU's external action and Europe's role in the world, which is in itself quite striking, and I think demonstrates the strong interest in building the EU's role and engagement in the world. And of course, the European Development Days also coincide with a raft of big negotiations at international level, a whole triad starting with Addis Ababa in July on financing, moving on to New York in September, and then on to Paris for the climate conference in December. So these events taken together form the post-2015 development agenda, and in that particular context, of course, we found that it was particularly suitable to launch a debate on the role of the national human rights institutions, that in their independent capacity, they are a key partner for the EU and have a major stake in the implementation and monitoring of the future sustainable development goals. The institutions, in fact, have a unique function in building bridges between government and civil society, and it's through their monitoring, reporting, complaints handling and advisory mandate that the institutions can maintain their role and strengthen it in upholding international human rights standards at home. This is about accountability in the end, and it is up to you to help us in reinforcing that role in the period ahead. We have many opportunities and challenges in the post-2015 agenda. Now, human rights is something we advocate all the time in the context of the SDG, and will continue to do so in a cross-cutting way. At the same time, I should also mention the importance of gender equality, which is of course also part of the Sustainable Development Goals, both in a particular goal and also in a more horizontal manner. And we are equally committed in this area to take the issue of gender equality and empowerment forward. So on the whole, I'd say that the EU stands for an ambitious agenda in the SDGs and in the period ahead. And we count on your support, be it the national institutions, be it civil society, all stakeholders and development actors, to help us implement the SDGs in practical and tangible ways. And that's why we've chosen for the first topic of our special seminar to focus on the role of the national human rights institutions in their sustainable development goals. So with those words, I think we're ready to turn to the panel. I should probably say that at one point, when the formal opening ceremony of the European Development Days starts at around 11:15, we will break up because the formal event with a number of high-ranking speakers, including President Juncker, will be screened here, so you'll all have a chance to see it. But first, I hope we will have a good and stimulating debate that we can all draw on as food for thought in the period ahead. So with those words, I think we're ready to start on our panel debate. We're very lucky to have all distinguished speakers to join us here today. We're now ready to start our panel debate, and we're very lucky to have here today four very distinguished speakers to give their perspective on the situation and also to join in a debate. I'm very happy first to introduce Mr. Laurence Mushwana, who has joined us from South Africa. You are the chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission and chairperson of the International Coordinating Committee for National Human Rights Institutions, as well as a former ombudsman and MP. Now, we'd like to hear a little bit more from your perspective about how you see the role of the national institutes in implementing the SDG. What do you think the SDGs will do for human rights in the years to come, and how can the national human rights institutions make the best use of them? So I pass the floor to you, please. Feel free to either sit down or use the lectern.
Thank you, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe before I begin, I need to acknowledge the European Commission Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development as funders and organizers of this major two-day special event dedicated to NHRIs and development. Through the EU's generosity, it has been ensured that there is a large contingent of approximately 100 national human rights institutions representatives from all regions around the globe here today. For the International Coordinating Committee of National Institutions for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, its regional bodies and members, this event will no doubt be a significant, if not historical, gathering, in that it will potentially influence NHRI's practice in the area of human rights and development for years to come. This special event will also serve to cement the growing partnership between the EU and the ICC, its regional bodies and member NHRIs, as we move closer toward the implementation of a 3-year project through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. Independent national human rights institutions, in comparison to states and NGOs, are relatively newcomers in the human rights arena. It is only in the past 2 decades that there has been a substantial increase in the number of NHRIs. This is due largely to their increasing recognition as important stakeholders that have much to contribute towards ensuring the promotion and protection of human rights. While civil society was already formally recognized as a key stakeholder alongside member states in 1948 in the UN Charter, it was only in 1993, by way of a General Assembly resolution that endorsed the Paris Principles, that energy rights came to be recognized at an international level. Today, there are over 100 countries that have established independent national institutions, of which 71 currently enjoy formal recognition and participation right within the Human Rights Council and its related organs. This recognition is provided through a rigorous accreditation process that is run under the auspices of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights by the International Coordination Committee, which is the international umbrella body of NHRIs. Those national institutions that are fully compliant with the Paris Principles are granted formal recognition by receiving an A status. The year 1993, when the Paris Principles were recognized by the UN, was also a significant year with the hosting of the World Conference on Human Rights and the adoption of the States of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. The declaration marked a renewed effort to strengthen human rights globally. It also recognized the role of NHRIs in the promotion and protection of human rights and encouraged all states to establish them. National institutions play a unique and key role in the promotion and protection of human rights at a domestic level through education and awareness programs, research, and complaints handling. Another important role of national human rights institutions is to cooperate with the United Nations. It is in this way that NHRIs play an important role in advocating for recognition and implementation of international human rights standards at a domestic level, provide independent and credible information to UN bodies, and assist with follow-up to UN recommendations. It is for this reason that the United Nations recognizes national institutions as their natural partner at a domestic level, creating a bridge between the international and domestic spheres. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is trite that the Millennium Development Goals failed to directly incorporate a human rights-based approach, despite being consistent with a number of human rights standards and principles. After 15 years, the MDGs will be replaced later this year with a set of sustainable development goals that will firmly incorporate a human rights-based approach. The inextricability of human rights from development is now seen in all aspects of UN work, most recently affirmed in the Secretary General's so-called Rights Up Front initiative. Where human rights travel, so too do national institutions, and therefore it is not a question of whether, but rather how will NHRI ensure that the new sustainable development goals are implemented and achieved at a domestic level. In fact, it will become a foregone conclusion that NHRIs will be actively involved at a domestic level and bring their expertise and unique responsibilities to contribute toward the successful implementation of the SDGs. One particular area in which national institutions can be involved is in the monitoring of the SDGs implementation and ensuring that the disaggregation of data ensures that the poor and vulnerable become beneficiaries, thereby transforming human rights into tangible lived experiences. NHRIs will also play an important role in the agreed accountability mechanism in that they can provide credible and independent information at international level. In all of this, the ICC, as the representative body of NHRIs at an international level, will play an advocacy role at a high level on behalf of its members to ensure that NHRI's potential can be harnessed within the SDG processes. There will be a need for the UN to ensure that national institutions are formally recognized within the implementation, monitoring, and accountability framework of the SDGs. And there is much work that is required on this front. The ICC will also support NHRIs through education and awareness programs on the SDGs and facilitate information sharing on experience, challenges, and best practices. Finally, there is much work to be done in order that we move closer to a world in which poverty and inequality is reduced, where effective governance and the rule of law is the norm, and where people live in peace and prosperity. In this endeavor, we must all join hands and work together as we dare not fail on this noble cause. I will pause here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mushwana, for those interesting words. And we will now move on to our next speaker, Michel Faust, who's UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, but you also have a long and distinguished past with the French National Consultative Commission on Human Rights. So I think that'll provide a good basis for your views on the national human rights institutions and how they can seek to improve better implementation of human rights in the national development processes. So please, Mr. Faust.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Je vais donc m'exprimer en français, si vous le permettez. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues et chers amis, puisque je reconnais dans la salle un grand nombre de collègues, d'amis, d'institutions nationales, et c'est avec plaisir que je vous retrouve aujourd'hui à Bruxelles pour cette session d'inauguration sur le rôle des institutions nationales dans l'accès et la promotion des politiques de développement. Mais, comme l'a précisé la Présidente, c'est plutôt dans la fonction de rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies sur la situation des défenseurs des droits de l'homme que je vais vous dire en quoi il me semble que la réalisation du droit au développement est, de mon point de vue, l'une des pierres angulaires de l'action des défenseurs des droits de l'homme, et je considère bien évidemment les institutions nationales comme étant des défenseurs des droits de l'homme. Les INDH, les institutions nationales, sont pour moi des acteurs œuvrant dans le respect et la promotion des droits de l'homme, et je me réjouis que la Commission européenne en ait fait l'une des priorités clés pour la stratégie droits de l'homme qu'elle a développée, et je suis heureux de l'entendre confirmer par la bouche de la Présidente. Ces institutions qui ne sont ni gouvernementales, même si elles ont pour mission d'éclairer la décision publique, si elles ne sont ni des ONG, même si elles élaborent des politiques à partir du pluralisme de la société civile, sont en cela la voix et les gardiens des droits humains de l'intérieur du pays. Mes prédécesseurs et moi-même n'avons jamais cessé de rappeler que l'une des fonctions les plus fondamentales des institutions nationales est de veiller à ce que les principes et les normes du droit international des droits de l'homme soient véritablement intégrés dans les législations nationales et qu'elles soient systématiquement prises en compte, prises en considération dans le développement des politiques publiques. Et cela, pour moi, inclut bien évidemment aussi les politiques publiques des États en matière de droit au développement. Dans le cadre des politiques de développement des États, il est essentiel de prendre en compte la pluralité d'acteurs, à la fois acteurs étatiques et acteurs non étatiques, tous engagés dans ces questions, et je pense plus particulièrement, et on aura l'occasion d'y revenir, aux entreprises transnationales, aux institutions financières internationales et aux autres bailleurs de fonds. Et pour comprendre l'aspect multidimensionnel de cette question, il faut, je crois, sortir de l'opposition stérile ou d'une prétendue hiérarchisation entre développement, droit au développement et droits de l'homme. Car, de mon point de vue, et on le dit toujours, l'un et l'autre, les deux sont indissociables. Comment aboutir au développement durable, pérenne des pays, si les droits les plus fondamentaux des personnes ne sont plus respectés, qu'il s'agisse de leurs droits civils et politiques, mais aussi des droits économiques, sociaux et culturels. Et dans ce cadre, les politiques de développement doivent reconnaître à chaque occasion l'interdépendance entre tous ces droits et favoriser des approches basées sur les droits des personnes. Malheureusement, l'opposition entre développement et droits humains sert souvent, et je l'ai constaté, à discréditer le travail des défenseurs des droits de l'homme. Les défenseurs des droits de l'homme engagés sur les questions de développement subissent d'innombrables pressions, de nombreuses entraves et des menaces au quotidien. Les défenseurs qui sont mobilisés contre les projets liés aux industries extractives, ceux qui s'opposent aux expulsions forcées organisées dans le cadre de grands événements sportifs, ou bien des projets d'urbanisme sont malheureusement harcelés, ils sont attaqués, ils sont emprisonnés, ils sont parfois assassinés. Et souvent, malheureusement, l'accès à la justice, l'accès à la réparation leur est impossible, tant il existe dans tellement de pays une culture de l'impunité et des liens de connivence entre certains acteurs économiques et les États de leur pays. Les États et certains acteurs non étatiques dénigrent trop souvent l'action de ces défenseurs, des défenseurs des droits de l'homme dans leur pays, en les définissant souvent comme des acteurs hostiles au développement de leur pays. Ces entraves ont été largement évoquées dans plusieurs rapports d'organisations non gouvernementales, mais je les ai également rencontrés lors des 6 consultations régionales que j'ai menées depuis que j'ai été nommé, que ce soit en Amérique latine, en Asie ou encore en Afrique où j'étais la semaine dernière, consultations pour lesquelles j'ai été heureusement soutenu par l'Union européenne. Oui, les institutions nationales des droits de l'homme sont des défenseurs des droits de l'homme et sont souvent, à ce titre, menacés par leur propre gouvernement. Et j'ai été amené à intervenir, et il faut le rappeler sans cesse, en leur faveur, à plusieurs reprises depuis quelques semaines et depuis que j'ai été nommé à cette fonction. Je ne liste pas aujourd'hui les pays, mais plusieurs de nos collègues sont à l'heure actuelle l'objet de menaces, d'attaques directes de la part des États à cause de leur prise de position courageuse sur le droit au développement ou sur l'ensemble des droits. Elles ont alors pourtant un vrai rôle à jouer en tant que mécanisme d'alerte, et elles le jouent de mécanisme de conseil pour assurer que les États respectent réellement leurs obligations et que des tiers, tels que les acteurs du secteur privé, ne portent pas atteinte aux droits des populations. Les INDH peuvent par ailleurs proposer des recommandations à destination des États, mais aussi à destination de groupes marginalisés ou particulièrement vulnérables. Et elles ont également un rôle essentiel pour inciter les États à se mettre en conformité avec les normes internationales ou bien les normes régionales relatives aux droits humains. Par ailleurs, et je le rappellerai dans mon prochain rapport qui sera présenté à l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies en octobre prochain, qu'il est important d'intégrer les acteurs de développement dans la composition même des institutions nationales afin que la diversité de la société civile soit réellement représentée et que les questions de développement soient effectivement prises en compte dans le travail des INDH. Elles peuvent par exemple, et je le souhaite, comme elles le font avec les défenseurs, intégrer des points focaux spécialisés sur les questions de droit au développement au sein de leur institution et ainsi favoriser la création de plateformes d'échange. Je l'ai dit, pardonnez-moi d'y revenir, mais c'est important pour moi, les INDH peuvent être la cible d'attaques, de menaces, de harcèlement dans le cadre de leur travail en faveur des droits de l'homme. Lors des 2 consultations régionales que j'ai organisées il y a quelques jours, à Kampala pour l'Afrique de l'Est et à Abidjan pour l'Afrique de l'Ouest, une centaine de défenseurs de l'Afrique m'ont rencontré, je les ai réunis et ils m'ont parlé des attaques, ils ont parlé des menaces, ils ont parlé des pressions qu'ils subissent de la part de leur État et à quel point les membres et le personnel de leurs institutions sont menacés à l'heure actuelle par l'État. Il est donc indispensable de rappeler que les États doivent mettre tout en œuvre pour permettre à ces institutions de fonctionner en toute indépendance et avec efficacité, en conformité avec les principes de Paris. Au niveau du système des Nations Unies, de nombreuses initiatives ont été menées ces dernières années Et il existe également, vous le savez, ce qu'on appelle les procédures spéciales qui permettent de lier de manière plus systématique le respect des droits de l'homme et les questions de droit au développement. Plusieurs de mes collègues, rapporteurs spéciaux ou experts indépendants, abordent à l'heure actuelle dans leur rapport ces questions telles le rapporteur spécial sur les droits de l'homme et l'extrême pauvreté, le rapporteur spécial sur le droit à l'alimentation, le rapporteur spécial sur le logement adéquat ou encore le rapporteur spécial sur les droits des personnes des peuples autochtones. En ce qui concerne le mandat qui m'a été confié sur la situation des défenseurs des droits de l'homme, une attention toute particulière est portée à ceux dont l'action porte sur les questions de développement. Des actions conjointes avec d'autres titulaires de mandat sont menées à l'heure actuelle pour rappeler aux États leurs obligations dans la protection des INDH et de tous les autres défenseurs. Des actions conjointes également entre les mécanismes, comme l'Union européenne, qui a, et j'espère qu'on en parlera, développé ces fameuses lignes directrices de l'Union européenne pour la protection des défenseurs, ainsi que d'autres acteurs engagés dans cette thématique, doivent également être menés et renforcés. Enfin, dans le rapport que j'évoquais à l'Assemblée générale, je ferai un certain nombre de recommandations et de constats qui seront les conclusions des 7 consultations régionales que j'ai menées. Et encore une fois, un volet là sera consacré spécifiquement non seulement aux recommandations adressées aux États, mais adressées également aux organisations non gouvernementales qui, malheureusement, pour beaucoup d'entre elles, ne prennent pas encore assez en compte des questions de droit au développement. Des recommandations concrètes à la direction des États, des recommandations aux organisations internationales et à la société civile seront également formulées pour améliorer la protection des défenseurs et leur permettre de jouer pleinement leur rôle dans la promotion et la protection des droits humains. Et ce, pour terminer, mesdames et messieurs, que pour moi, le respect constant des droits fondamentaux offre, je crois, une clé formidable de répartition des richesses engendrées par les politiques de développement dans un effort d'entraînement enclenchant un cercle vertueux. Mesdames et messieurs, omettre d'articuler les politiques de développement autour du respect de sa population et des droits fondamentaux conduit trop souvent à une société injuste, une société inégalitaire, une société sans perspective d'avenir. Les progrès des États ne se mesurent pas à la richesse accumulée par quelques-uns ou par quelques grandes industries internationales, mais plutôt par la somme des possibilités individuelles et collectives dans laquelle la population se reconnaît et peut s'estimer. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forst, for sharing your experience, your practical experience as UN Special Rapporteur for human rights defenders. It's interesting to hear how your constant dialogue, consultations, recommendations create added value and the experience you actually have on the ground, which I hope we can debate later on. Now let's move on to our third panelist, Mr. Vladlen Stefanov. You are head of the National Institutions and Regional Mechanism section in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we would now like to hear your perspective about what the international community can do to help create an enabling environment for the national institutions. Please, Mr. Stefanov.
Director, Madam Knudsen, ICC Chair, Adam Bushwana, Special Rapporteur, Mr. Forst, and Executive Director, Mr. Sayas, distinguished chairs and members of national human rights institutions from all over the world, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and indeed an honor to address you today at the seminar of National Human Rights Institutions during the European Development Days. At the outset, I would like to pay tribute to the European Commission and the ICC for the excellent organization of this first of its kind event targeting national human rights institutions on the occasion of the European Development Days. This seminar takes place in a crucial juncture of time when world leaders and development stakeholders are discussing the post-2015 development agenda. The SDGs framework so far has included key human rights elements, as mentioned by Advocate Mushwana, across 17 goals and 169 targets, to be complemented by the declaration, means of its implementation, as well as follow-up and review frameworks, which are being currently negotiated. The national level review process will be the most important aspect of following up on the SDGs, as this is the level at which the goals will be implemented and where accountability lies between governments and their citizens. NHRIs can play a unique role in strengthening the accountability of state and non-state actors to the people by ensuring that the human rights-based approach is effectively applied when adapting, implementing, and monitoring the SDGs at the national level. For example, national human rights institutions could facilitate the dialogue and interactions between state, private sector, civil society actors, and the people at large. The aim of this dialogue is to ensure that recommendations from international human rights mechanisms are duly reflected in the identification of national commitments to the SDGs targets. They should be also reflected in the formulation of policies and programs to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and in monitoring progress that leaves no one behind. The national human rights institutions therefore can be important partners to states in clarifying their human rights obligations in relation to all aspects of SDGs implementation, monitoring, and review. They can help to ensure the systematic flow of human rights information between different national actors, while increasing broader public awareness on these issues. This would result in strengthened accountability of states to the people, as well as accountability of other actors, including the private sector and businesses. National human rights institutions could critically and substantively contribute to participatory national reports on the SDG implementation, including by partnering with civil society. National institutions can provide human rights analysis of SDG implementation in their submissions to the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and the treaty body country reviews. The central imperative of having no one behind will require monitoring progress for all, with the aim of reducing inequalities and eliminating discrimination. This, in turn, will require a disaggregation of data, wherever possible, by all prohibited grounds of discrimination, as required by the human rights law. For example, by race, ethnicity, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. In addition, since other status is not exhaustive, the grounds should also include those specified by the international human rights mechanisms, including age, nationality, marital and family status, sexual orientation and gender identity, health status, place of residence, economic and social situation. Relevant further categories of disaggregation in each country context should be defined through an inclusive and participatory process, and NHRIs can help to ensure that all relevant groups are identified and involved in that process, while at the same time ensuring that their human rights including the right to privacy, are duly protected. National human rights institutions can advocate for strengthened legal protection of human rights and play a quasi-judicial role when they investigate individual complaints or pursue legal redress through amicus interventions and public interest litigation. Ladies and gentlemen, since the national human rights institutions have such an important role, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, through its headquarters structure, our field presences, and the United Nations country teams provides support to national institutions around the world. In conducting many of our activities, we collaborate with regional coordinating committees of national institutions and the ICC itself. Current work by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights with national institutions is focused on 4 major areas. First, country engagement, through which OHCHR supports efforts by governments to establish and strengthen national institutions. Second, monitoring and advice, through which the Office of the High Commissioner assesses compliance with the Paris Principles and strengthens the capacity of national institutions to work effectively and independently. Third, assisting the interaction between national institutions and the international human rights system. And fourth, strengthening partnerships, especially with United Nations agencies and programs on the ground, the ICC, regional organizations, as well as regional coordinating bodies of national institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my deep appreciation to representatives of national institutions and to all of you who traveled from all over the world to attend this important meeting. Your commitment to human rights, and especially the work of national institutions, regional networks, and the ICC are very much appreciated and recognized by our office. I thank you, and I wish you fruitful deliberations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stefanov, for that useful insight. There were a lot of very concrete and practical ideas on what national human rights institutions can do, and it'll be interesting to hear from you afterwards what you think of those points. Now, we've had 2 speakers on the UN side, providing the angle from that of an international organisation, and we now move into a completely different sphere. Our next speaker is Ignacio Saiz, and indeed it's a different angle because you're the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which is an international NGO in New York and Lima, working to promote human rights in economic and social development policy. So given your background, it'd be interesting to hear more from you about how NGOs can contribute to support national institutes of human rights. But in addition, I also know that you, together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, have written a paper on the SDGs and how to implement them in the area of human rights. So there are 2 interesting elements here which you can perhaps follow up on. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much, Lotte, and thank you to the European Commission, to the ICC, and to the regional networks for organizing this important event and a very timely discussion on the role of NHRIs in the post-2015 agenda. I'm a little bit embarrassed to stand before you as the 4th man on this panel, but hopefully I can bring diversity, as Lotte said, because I do bring an NGO perspective to this discussion. CSR is an organization that has been working very actively with NHRIs on a range of issues, including this agenda. And so I wanted to share with you what we see as the reasons why the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, should matter to NHRIs, and also what role NHRIs can play in their implementation, and then to end with a couple of points on challenges and the role that NGOs might be able to play in helping NHRIs overcome those challenges. So why should the SDGs matter to NHRIs? I would say for three reasons. Firstly, their political importance. The SDGs will set the development agenda for the next 15 years. They will dictate policy priorities, funding flows at the national, the regional, and the global level. Now, even though these are just political commitments, they're not binding legal standards like human rights instruments. The truth is that the SDGs, like the MDGs before them, will have more political currency than the human rights treaties that states have ratified. It's sad that that's the case, but it's a political reality. Frankly, governments have taken their MDG commitments more seriously than their obligations under the international covenants on human rights. And that's why some of us in the human rights community, in the human rights NGO community, have been advocating for several years now that the new goals that are adopted this year need to be aligned with human rights standards. And that's important because these new development goals must serve to reinforce states' accountability to their existing human rights commitments. And this brings me to the second reason why the SDGs should matter to human rights. And that's because the SDGs, unlike the MDGs, are much more directly relevant to human rights. The relevance of the SDGs goes way beyond Goal 16. It's often said that Goal 16 is the human rights goal. I would really challenge that. Goal 16 on accountable institutions and access to justice is indeed a notable gain because the MDGs were silent on issues of civil and political rights, and their inclusion was controversial. And now we have a goal that includes targets on access to information, participation, protecting fundamental freedoms. Indeed, the existence of an independent NHRI is a proposed indicator for meeting this particular goal. But I want to stress that the SDGs are of even broader relevance to economic, social, and cultural rights. For obvious reasons, most of the goals address key economic, social, and cultural rights issues such as health, education, water and sanitation, food and nutrition, decent work, social protection. Now, the difference from the MDGs is that whereas the MDGs undercut economic and social rights standards quite significantly on these issues, the SDGs and their targets are much more aligned with the provisions of economic, social, and cultural rights standards, largely due to the advocacy that many NGOs and OHCHR and others have done on these issues. To give you an example, housing. Under the MDGs, MDG Goal 7D said, improve the lives of 100 million slum dwellers. Now this has been met, so you could say it's a success. But it's been met through measures which include forced evictions, and this goal has done nothing to stop an increase overall in absolute terms in the number of slum dwellers. There are now 200 million more slum dwellers in the world than there were before due to increase in population and urbanization. So that's an example of how not to set an indicator or a target from a human rights perspective. The SDG targets on housing are now framed much more human rights compliantly. Ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing with special attention to the needs of women, people with disabilities and older persons. You can see it's a completely different framing, much more consistent with international standards on economic, social and cultural rights. And another striking feature of the relevance of the SDGs is the new commitment to tackling inequality much more frontally. So Goal 5 on gender equality is much more comprehensive and is set to give a real renewed boost to CEDAW implementation, to the implementation of the Women's Convention. And this emphasis on leave no one behind has meant far greater attention to the disparities that are faced by people with disabilities, older persons, indigenous peoples, as well as prominent attention to income inequality. And I know this is an issue of increasing concern to NHRIs in many parts of the world since the global economic crisis, the widening of income and wealth inequality. So unlike the MDGs, the SDGs can be seen as an agenda for equality, and that's hugely relevant to NHRIs and equality bodies who have anti-discrimination and equality as their mandate. And the third reason why the SDGs matter is their universal applicability. The MDGs were seen as an agenda for developing countries alone, with industrialized countries merely playing a supporting role in international development cooperation. The SDGs are a different story. It's a universal agenda. They place commitments on all countries, including wealthier ones, to address deprivation, exclusion, and inequality in their own countries, as well as to address the responsibility that they bear, these wealthier countries, for undermining development and human rights abroad. So that means that NHRIs in wealthier countries, in all regions, can really help policymakers engage both with the domestic dimensions of the SDG commitments, what development means in Europe internally, but also the international dimensions through the lens of extraterritorial human rights obligations. So for these reasons, the SDGs should be a central concern to NHRIs from every country represented in this forum. They matter politically, they matter to human rights, and they matter universally. So what role for NHRIs? How can they engage? Well, as other speakers have said, NHRIs have a unique role to play given their mandate and their functions. As independent and permanent bodies with an official mandate to ensure that all branches of government uphold their international commitments, we and many others in civil society see NHRIs as a critical piece in the accountability architecture of the SDGs. NHRIs have often been described, and indeed have been on this panel, as playing a bridging role between the national and the international, between government and civil society, across government institutions and areas of policy. And that bridging role is particularly valuable in this context, because you need institutions working at those interfaces to play a leading role in overseeing implementation and monitoring of the new commitments. And I think all NHRI functions, whether it's the monitoring, the reporting, the advisory role, the complaints handling, all of these can make a distinct and valuable contribution to the implementation of the SDGs. In the briefing that Lotte mentioned that we have produced with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we propose a number of concrete ways in which NHRIs can engage in implementation. I don't really have time to canvass them all. I'll just flag them and would alert you to the briefing, which I think was circulated to all participants at this forum. Firstly, I would say that NHRIs have a key role to play in the national tailoring of goals, targets, and indicators. This is a process that is beginning to happen already. While the agenda is a universal one, certain targets, indicators, and benchmarks will need to be set at the national level, reflecting different national contexts and realities. Now, NHRIs have a huge role to play in ensuring that this tailoring process doesn't serve to undercut human rights standards, but takes the substantive provisions of human rights norms into account in that national tailoring. A second role is around advising governments on their national plans and policies intended to give effect to the SDGs. Now, this could be on national development plans as a whole. The Palestinian Independent Commission, for example, is looking at how its development plan writ large relates to human rights. Or it could be on particular areas of expertise that NHRIs have in a given context, whether it's gender discrimination, monitoring incarceration rates, where here, in such cases, NHRIs might undertake, for example, or might propose human rights impact assessments of certain policies that are being proposed. So these are examples of how they can advise governments on the policies intended to implement the SDGs. Many of you will have heard in the discussions around the SDGs the notion of policy coherence. This is a big buzzword around ensuring that all areas of public policy serve to promote development. Well, this surely is a critical role for NHRIs because NHRIs have that broad mandate. They can and should supervise the coherence of all areas of public policy with human rights commitments. And that includes the policy coherence between domestic policy and global policy. Here I want to draw your attention to some very interesting work the German Institute for Human Rights has done with regard to policy coherence domestically and internationally. A recent paper which the German Institute has done on extraterritorial obligations and how an NHRI can play a role in monitoring and following up complaints of complaints that a country's national development cooperation policies have infringed human rights abroad. So it's a good example of looking at that policy coherence between the domestic and the international. I also wanted to add that in terms of advising on policies, NHRIs can play a crucial role not just in the content of those policies, but how they are financed. Questions of budgeting are questions of human rights. And there's a lot that has been done to monitor budgets, both the tax side and the budget side, from a human rights perspective. And this is a critical role that NHRIs can play. Thirdly, and I'll be very brief here, a third task is around monitoring progress on the SDG commitments from a human rights perspective. My previous speakers have talked a lot about this, but I think there's a particular role that NHRIs can play in being attentive to tracking patterns of inequality. My fear is that, or a widespread fear, is that even though the SDGs contain good commitments on inequality, that in the monitoring, that's where that attention to disaggregation, that attention to discrimination will fall through the cracks. And I think NHRIs have such experience in monitoring standards like CEDAW, the CRPD. These instruments, in a sense, should be the normative framework guiding how leave no one behind is operationalized, how that principle is operationalized. To move on, the fourth role that I think NHRIs can play is in fostering accountability of state institutions and securing redress for victims of abuse. Now, in the current discussions going on right now in New York, there is a real aversion to the term accountability. You'll see people treading on eggshells with the language of accountability. And it's become controversial, and even the word monitoring to some has become unpalatable. And that's why the language has been diluted to follow up and review. So accountability has become follow up and review. That's for reasons, for logical reasons that have to do with North-South dynamics at the UN. Many developing states or G77 states are concerned that accountability is code word for finger wagging by rich countries and aid conditionality. But we're trying to navigate that dynamic and reinsert the language of accountability, because after all, this agenda is about boosting accountability, and NHRIs are all about accountability. So my point is that NHRIs can contribute even on the hard-edged dimension of accountability. What do I mean by this? Well, many NHRIs have quasi-judicial mandates to receive complaints, to conduct investigations and audits into human rights violations. So they have a unique and valuable role to play in channeling grievances brought by people who claim their rights have been deprived in the development context, in relation to a policy being implemented under the SDGs. And NHRIs can ensure those deprived of their rights in the development context obtain remedies and that institutional failures are rectified. Of all the accountability mechanisms that are under discussion, very few are addressing this harder-edged dimension of accountability. And that's why I think NHRIs have an indispensable role to play. As has been previously mentioned, NHRIs have a critical role to play in ensuring accountability of all actors, not just state actors, including those beyond the state. The post-2015 and financing for development negotiations have assumed that there will be an increasing role for the private sector in financing and delivering on sustainable development. And there has been very little effort taken to include safeguards in the SDGs against the negative effects that corporate activity can have on human rights and development, from natural resource extraction to mass tax evasion. Now, the increased attention that NHRIs are going to be giving in the coming years to the human rights impact of the private sector, and NHRI's ability to receive complaints concerning business-related abuse, applying the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, these will be particularly important in rectifying this serious accountability deficit in the SDGs. And finally, the last area where I think NHRIs can really play a role is around civil society participation. It is crucial that civil society remains actively engaged in monitoring these commitments, in their implementation, in helping to formulate and design policies to give effect to these development commitments. But there is a real fear, we are very concerned, that we as civil society will be cut out of the process. This was a very consultative process up to now, when it was a question of designing the goals. You know, the participation levels have been unprecedented, and I would be the first to acknowledge. But there is a fear that many member states are saying to us, okay, your moment has passed. We now leave this to the big boys. now leave this to the member states. And so there is a serious concern that the impetus to engage, to involve, to engage civil society will be lost. When you also take into account what Michel Faust was describing, the serious patterns of repression that many of those activists and defenders who are focused on economic and social rights or on issues of development, that they face, then you can see why this is a very, very real concern. NHRIs, because of their bridging role, because of their convening power, they have a key role to play in ensuring that this closure of civil society space is challenged and doesn't happen. So to conclude, what can be done to enable NHRIs to engage more effectively, and what can we, from an NGO perspective, contribute? So it's clear that NHRIs have a very valuable role to play, and we've seen that there are many entry points. But we have seen in the many years of work with NHRIs that many institutions face challenges, serious challenges, which need to be overcome if this potential role that I'm describing is to be fulfilled. Those challenges are very varied. They include constraints on their mandates in some cases, constraints on their independence in other cases, and probably in all cases, constraints on capacity and resources. So I want to focus here on that latter, because my organization, the Center for Economic and Social Rights, has been working for the last 5 years or so to help NHRIs monitor economic, social and cultural rights more effectively. And so we've seen firsthand the challenges that they face and that many of us in the human rights movement face in this sphere. Because the fact is that economic and social rights require different tools of research, different tools of analysis and evidence gathering than civil and political rights. For example, you need to engage more with quantitative methods, with the use of indicators, you need to engage more with social and economic policy analysis, tax and budget analysis, in order to assess whether states are generating and using their resources in human rights compliant ways. We've been helping NHRIs in different contexts to skill up on their approaches to ESCR monitoring. We've been in a very fruitful partnership with the Asia-Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions, and have been working with NHRIs in the region there to apply innovative monitoring methods to assess socioeconomic policies and development policies from a human rights perspective. As a result, we're producing a training manual, Defending Dignity, on monitoring of ESC rights by national human rights institutions, and are also producing other resources with this aim. So we've seen, in conclusion, that there is a huge appetite for getting up to speed, for upping the game on economic and social rights monitoring by NHRIs, and there is increased interest by NHRIs in transforming this new development agenda into one that promotes accountability to people's human rights. After all, as the Declaration on the Right to Development says, the human being is the central subject of development. So this is a key opportunity for NHRIs to play a leading role in that transformation. I'm very pleased to see that the ICC and the regional networks are engaging with the European Commission's support in this process, and CSR, as many other civil society organizations, I'm sure, stand ready to assist however we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for that very rich contribution. We've now had input from all of the ICC side, from UN representatives, and from NGOs. So it's now time to turn to the floor. And I do indeed hope that we will see a better rebalancing on the question of gender, and that many of you will intervene to recreate a better diversity. But just a couple of points on what's been said so far. There seems to be a wide view that the SDGs are indeed more important than ever, more important than their predecessor, the MDGs, and that therefore the role of the human rights institutions will be absolutely critical and essential for the future, because the SDGs will follow us for the next decade, the next 15 years. There seem to be sort of two areas where the institutions could play a role, or rather two phases perhaps. One is an early phase, early intervention in terms of figuring out or helping to advise about how the SDG should be translated into national policy, and offering advice to see how that's done, combining that indeed with human rights impact assessment, policy coherence advice, and the budget aspect, as was mentioned. And the other side is then the follow-up in terms of monitoring, accountability, advice on redress. But anyway, the floor is open. I would just ask you to kindly introduce yourselves and whom you represent or where you are from. But, right, I'll take the gentleman in front of me first, and I think we'll try to regroup several questions. And either you can address the panel directly, but you're of course free to make observations and remarks in general.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Jan van der Veenis. I'm the Legal Desk Director of Waterlex. I'm actually representing Victoria Mohez, who is the Secretariat Leader of the NHRI Water Network. So she is a woman, but I'm here as a man. But speaking on behalf of women, obviously, as well. I think it's, we've been very successful with Waterlex, creating a water network, an NHRI water network, delivering trainings. Last year, 12 NHRIs were trained on water, and water is an obvious, thorough and strong link in the SDGs. With the help of the Danish Institute, the Hungarian Institute, and the South African Commission, with Karam Singh from the South African Institute. And I think we fully agree on the why and the what. I think the next step is also something that we should look at the how. So how do we empower NHRIs to enable them to take on SDGs, to enable them to take on, in my case, water issues which are related to food, energy, business, development, poverty relief. And a very good practical thing that we've developed is a best practices manual, and it's downloadable online at waterlex.org, but I have a few with me. And I think, and this is a question, linking to a question, and I have two small questions. My first question would be, so sharing the best practices, Mr. Mushwana also said, so it's very important. I think in this time and age we should make this sharing of best practices digitally possible, so that we create online networks that are easy accessible. We are working at a platform, but I think it's highly relevant for SDGs as well, and I would like to hear your opinion on that, of the distinguished panel. And my second question is also, we've been training national institutions, and immediately we saw, and we got requests from those institutions, come back and train our regional institutions. Because when we are talking to stakeholders, when we are talking to people on the ground, environmental, water, human rights defenders, it's the people that have very distinct cultural issues as well, in fact around water, around food. So you cannot just train a national institution and be gone. There's a very high link to the lowest level of participation in a country. So I would also see how the distinguished speakers see that as a channel, as a challenge, and how they would advise to take that on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's regroup some comments. Lady in front of me, please.
Bonjour, je suis Rabia Abdeloudoud, je préside la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme de la Mauritanie. Je suis très contente d'être là aujourd'hui avec vous. Ce que je voudrais dire, c'est que nous découvrons un langage que nous n'avions pas dans la plupart de nos pays, en ce sens que de la disponibilité de la Commission européenne, des Européens, de mieux enraciner ce dialogue avec les institutions nationales des droits de l'homme. Je suis à la Commission depuis quelques années déjà, Et ce que nous avons constaté dans la plupart de certains des pays, en tout cas africains, je parle sous le contrôle de certains de mes collègues avec lesquels j'ai échangé depuis hier, mais en tout cas pour mon pays, la Mauritanie, c'est qu'il y a un rejet total de la part de la délégation de l'Union européenne de travailler avec nous, et je vais vous expliquer pourquoi. Parce que les ONG nous diabolisent parce que nous ne faisons pas le travail de l'ONG, nous ne dénonçons pas assez fort et nous ne nous battons pas avec le gouvernement de façon frontale parce que ce n'est pas le mandat des INDH. Ou alors on nous trouve, en tout cas, c'est cette incompréhension du rôle des INDH qui pose problème. Il y a un espace de dialogue entre la Commission européenne au niveau de la Mauritanie et des organisations de la société civile dans lesquelles la Commission nous a exclus. Et donc ici, je voudrais vous dire cette appréhension et cette incompréhension, et aussi me féliciter que dans le futur, peut-être il y aura un nouveau partenariat dans ce sens. L'autre recommandation, c'est que quand on va rentrer chez nous dans 2 jours aussi, c'est de rendre compte un peu de cet espace de dialogue qu'il y a avec vous. Et au niveau donc, de la Commission européenne, nous voudrions que vous recommandiez à la délégation en Mauritanie d'essayer de nous comprendre en tant qu'INDH. Notre rôle, c'est d'abord de conseiller le gouvernement. Notre rôle, c'est aussi d'alerter sur les violations des droits de l'homme. Nous travaillons en synergie tous les jours avec le bureau du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies, que je félicite pour leur contribution, mais aussi avec les défenseurs de droits de l'homme. Je remercie Michel, qui est notre ami et mon président au niveau du CIC. Et je voudrais vous dire qu'on a beaucoup d'espoir pour ce nouveau partenariat avec l'Union européenne. Je vous remercie.
There was a gentleman right in front. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Good morning. This is Mohamed.Yassin UNIUD.IT. These valuable interventions for the SDGs, I don't believe that the world will take the same path which it has taken from 2000 up to 2015. The path and the velocity of development and dynamics will be more accelerated, so we will not expect to be binding to have the. I don't think that these SDGs are taking into consideration the dynamics and the change which will take place. And the most important events which will take place in Addis Ababa and in Paris and New York this year will determine how these SDGs will be framed. But it seems that already the agenda is already set, and most of the world will be only following. Going back to the role of the national institutions, the respect of human rights, and in your intervention you have mentioned that we have to engage the national institutions with the civil society organizations. However, these nations, especially in conflict-prone nations where there is no democracy, that governments are appointing their civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations are almost arms of that governments and dictatorship, and they are just trying to assist these governments in their policies. So what will be the remedies in this case? I don't think that the partnership with the national institutions will be effective and efficient in the respect of human rights and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a gentleman at the back. Please hold up your hands so staff can identify you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Henry. I come from Asia. I represent the Asian network of NGOs working with national human rights institutions across Asia, very closely associated with APF. This has been a wonderful panel. On the one hand, we've had the ICC, the UN Special Rapporteur, as well as the Office of the High Commission, speaking about the possibilities of action for intervention. And we've had civil society representative very excellently highlighting the major tasks that are before them. And for me, my concern is, are national human rights institutions independent enough to undertake this major task of monitoring governments on the issues of development policies? This is a great challenge. This is a challenge for national human rights institutions as well as for human rights defenders across Asia in particular. But without the standards of these institutions being enhanced, which means your accreditation standards being enhanced to real standards where we get independent institutions. We will not have the independent institutions which are necessary to undertake this very onerous task. I come from India where people speaking about development today are under restriction. Ford Foundation is blacklisted. Greenpeace has a number of cases in courts. Many of us are under attack. The national human rights institutions are carefully avoiding these issues. So the independent nature of the institution has to really be enhanced, which means the ICC SCA standards will definitely have to go higher than what it is today. Could we have a response from the ICC chair, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's take one more question before we get back to the panel. The lady to my left, please, hold up a hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the organization, the EU who organized the program, and of course appreciate the speakers with concern that they were all men. I'm Sima Samar from the chairperson of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, coming from a conflict and post-conflict, and I don't know which kind of a country. But the Human Rights Commission in Afghanistan, we did a monitoring of economic, social, and cultural rights from 2004 onward. We are publishing our reports every year with specific recommendation to the donors and also to the government, to the parliament, to most of the people. But the problem is that we do not have that capacity within the government to actually take those those recommendations really seriously. And one of the reasons is the donors have their own plan on development and social and cultural rights improvements in Afghanistan rather than one united approach. So my question is that how could we make the donors to act according to the MDG has gone to SDG? And the second question is that what mechanism that really keep them accountable in order to really pay what they promised and what they would do in their own respective countries. Like most of the, let's say, powerful countries or developed countries do not have national institution of human rights themselves. So what could be done in order to promote them and convince them to establish an independent national institution of human rights? Thank you.
Thank you. Should we perhaps give the panel a chance to respond very quickly? I think there are a couple of questions from Mr. Mushwana and afterwards for Ignacio. But perhaps you wish to reply to the questions about standards for institutions. And there was also a point about information exchange via websites and better training. I think the mic works.
Thank you. I think there are two important questions raised, firstly by the gentleman from the university, which is more or less the same question as asked by the gentleman from India. The question of countries where there is no democracy. And with regards to Asia, the question where NHRIs are being intimidated. I think these are concrete and real issues. We have experienced it so far. Maybe to start is what other mechanism, what experiences can we share, even if we live in a non-democratic countries? What is it that we can share together and still implement? For instance, here we are meeting on the ways and means of how to implement, monitor SDGs. How about asking, for instance, the Human Rights Council to ensure that during the UPR, which I believe all countries are keen to appear before the UPR, how about suggesting that within the UPR, one of the clauses that they need to ask each country that appears before it is related to the SDGs. Because you may have difficulties at home, but you can be able to network with the other countries that appear before the Human Rights Council. They can ask those questions for you. We have had situations where, for instance, in one country, where the entire Human Rights Commission was charged for having raised questions within the Human Rights Council. This is a real challenge. It's not theoretical. We do have countries where you cannot do anything. But in countries where you do exist, nevertheless, we need to find a way of dealing with the government. For instance, in our collaboration with NGOs, NGOs can say things that I cannot say as a national human rights institution. So it is important to forge relationships with NGO, universities. They can say things that I cannot say. So we need to be proactive, looking at what our act allows us to do. What can we do with civil societies, academicians, and related organizations? There are no easy answers, but I'm prepared to discuss further outside this because we don't have enough time. I thought I would just deal with that, but there are many. We'll see if we still have time.
Thank you. Perhaps, Mr. Aziz, you wish to say a word about civil society, NGOs, and how you argued that they were very involved, very much part of the consultation process. But I think there were some who expressed the view that NGOs were not always involved.
Is this working? Yeah. I don't recall hearing a question saying that NGOs weren't always involved, but that there, in certain conditions, the capacity for involvement is very limited, and in certain conditions, I think somebody said that the so-called NGOs are actually government appointed, so they don't have independence. I mean, I think up to now, as I said before, you have to distinguish between the different levels of participation in this process. This is a process that much of which has been led at the UN in New York, but a lot of it is going on at the regional level. Regional UN commissions, for example, are becoming increasingly important forums for decision-making on the post-2015 agenda. But the primary site of interest is the national level. And so levels of participation by NGOs have varied according to which sphere you're talking about. At the international level, it has been unprecedented. But like I said, in many countries, there's a tendency to close down civil society space, and my fear is that this window of opportunity that the post-2015 agenda opened will be shut quite fast. I wanted to respond to a couple of things that came up. Sharing best practices digitally, I think that's an important idea, and perhaps far be it from me to suggest this, but perhaps it's something that the ICC working group on post-2015 could consider as a task. Mapping where there is good practice and what can be learned from it. When we were putting together the briefing with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we tried to highlight some good practices, and they're mentioned in the briefing. But I'm sure there are many more that are simply not documented or not widely shared within the NHRI community. So that would be a very important task. I think in the manual that we've been putting together with the Asia Pacific Forum on NHRIs, we've also tried to cite good practices from within the Asia Pacific region, specifically on monitoring economic and social rights or monitoring development policies. On the issue of, are NHRIs independent enough? I think this was Henry's question. Just one thing that's of interest, as I think I mentioned, was that under Goal 16 on accountable institutions and governance, one of the proposed indicators, and the discussion around indicators is still ongoing, but one of the proposed indicators is the existence of an A-grade NHRI, which is quite remarkable. That's, the NHRIs are now firmly, explicitly in there in the SDGs in that context. And so, if that gets adopted as an indicator, then the SDGs themselves, Goal 16, will be a spur to NHRIs upping their standards. It will be an incentive, an added incentive, an international incentive for NHRIs to meet the requirements of the Paris Principles. So that's something of note, I think. To Seema's question about how to make donors accountable, I mean, this is really the elephant in the room around the post-2015 agenda. I think the SDGs are different in contrast to the MDGs. The accountability relationship in the MDGs, let's be frank, was primarily one of donors, of developing countries' accountability to their donors. Not so much developing governments accountable to their citizens, or all governments accountable to their citizens, but it was a one-way relationship to donors. And I think we've moved away from that paradigm. But the power dynamic is still there, and the reality that you described in Afghanistan is, I'm sure, the reality in many countries, that NHRIs may do a fantastic job in making recommendations, but the executive or the government can't act on them because they're constrained because of other policy priorities that are being pushed on them, either internally or externally. I think this is why we and some others in the human rights community, have been very interested in the notion of extraterritorial obligations, because that's a human rights response to this question. What normative standards do we have to hold donors to account? Extraterritorial human rights obligations. How do they apply in the SDG context? We published on this, and some others are doing excellent work as well, and I think that might hold the key to a human rights response to the phenomenon that you're raising. Apologies.
Thank you. I think we need another round of questions, as there are lots of observations out there. Let me just say that when it comes to our future action plan on human rights, this will be an action plan where it's for member states, the EU institutions to do the implementation. And our delegations are also part of that process of implementation. So there will be further up at the level of delegations in terms of looking after the first priority of capacity building for national human rights institutions. Also, just on civil society and NGOs, we do a great deal, and probably have more funding for that thematic subject than anything else, to support, again, the capacity building, the networking of civil society and NGOs, as well as local authorities. And so let's hope that also gradually yields results. Right, further questions? The gentleman at the back, please hold up your hand. Yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tobias Schmidt from Waterlex International Secretariat in Geneva. I have a question actually to all panelists based on a sense of urgency. I'll start with the words of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights in Water and Sanitation, Katrina Albuquerque, who is now no longer the Special Rapporteur, but she has worked on the topic for 6 years. She has commented largely on the subject of access to water and sanitation, saying that during the Millennium Development Goals, it was possible to go through the whole period and realize the Millennium Development Goals in the sense that the aggregate statistics pointed to the realization of the goal. At the same time, the lowest 20%, the poorest 20% of the population globally was not incorporated in the planning exercise. So the specific targeting of the poorest and marginalized and the monitoring of whether or not that they are being included in the planning process is an essential part of the SDGs. Now, I think that one of the very positive outcomes of the MDGs is that they have built a huge monitoring capacity. So during the last 15 years, monitoring has really grown in its capacity. However, I noticed that during the Global Expanded Monitoring Initiative, which is expanding UNICEF and WHO's monitoring capacity to include also water resources planning, wastewater management, and so on, again, the national human rights institutions are not being involved. And with the Sustainable Development Goals having 169 separate monitoring indicators, I'm scared that the capacity at national level to monitor is going to be very weak unless NHRIs are involved in the process. So just to share a sense of urgency that I do not see NHRIs being mainstreamed in the monitoring institutions for monitoring the SDGs, and I would really advocate, certainly for the sphere of water, that they be part of this global expanded monitoring initiative, and I'd like to share and discuss with you on ways in which that could be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady right in front of me, please. The microphone is coming.
Thank you very much for this important session. Dr. Salam Al-Khafaji from Iraq High Commission for Human Rights, a board member. I'd like to mention something. In the case development needs a stability in the country, and when there is no there is a conflict or no political stability, it will affect any method for development. So how could we deal with that? Can the NHR can share in making conflict resolution between these political entities? This is firstly. Secondly, we are speaking about development after 2015. In Iraq, we need development after ISIL liberation from some areas. So how could we work when we have occupation of some foreigners as ISIL in Iraq in areas and other are liberated? And we have now some areas have been liberated, and we need to have them to have a development to be with the same line with the other governance. How could we work on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. The lady to my left, could you please stand up?
Merci, c'est Madame Kiabilois. Je suis du Forum interrégional des femmes congolaises de Belgique. Ma question s'adresse aux personnes qui ont parlé sur les droits de l'homme, mais c'est deux questions. D'abord, la première chose que j'allais dire, qui est importante, nous parlons beaucoup des droits de l'homme, nous assistons beaucoup à des violations des personnes dans les pays qui défendent les droits de l'homme. Nous avons des instances différentes et élevées. On a les Nations Unies, on a des grandes conférences comme ça, on a des organisations qui votent des lois, on a l'AE, donc on a beaucoup d'organes qui sont là, qui peuvent aussi prendre des décisions et des vraies décisions, mais entre-temps, on assiste chroniquement à des pays où on ne respecte pas les défenseurs de droits de l'homme. Or, si ces gens-là sont là pour défendre la population, pour revendiquer les droits de la population, pour établir un ordre de justice dans un pays où il y a beaucoup d'injustices et que ces personnes-là sont menacées, ça signifie que c'est difficile qu'on avance sur ce plan-là. Et dans les pays concernés, les gens qui font ces violations-là continuent. Et c'est au vu de tout le monde. Donc moi je pense qu'au niveau des grandes instances, il faut quand même qu'on arrive à prendre des décisions ou créer des moyens ou un organe qui puisse obliger les personnes qui violent les droits de l'homme ou dans lesquelles il n'y a pas de démocratie, qu'on trouve des moyens pour les obliger à installer la vraie démocratie chez eux et à laisser libre les personnes défenseuses des droits de l'homme, parce que ça nous emmène à un développement. Ça nous permet aussi d'atteindre les objectifs du millénium, les OED. Tout ce qu'on parle ici, tant que ces choses-là ne sont pas réellement prises en compte et que des actions réelles les contraignent, on tournera toujours dans ces choses-là qui retardent ce développement. Ça, c'est une chose. De deux, ça c'est un corollaire. Le problème de migration, par exemple, ça entre justement dans ces anomalies-là. Le problème de migration, tel que ça se vit dramatiquement aujourd'hui, ce n'était qu'un fil qui a commencé, mais maintenant ça éplore. Pourquoi? Parce que ces inégalités-là, ces anomalies-là, ces injustices-là continuent. Les gens qui viennent en cascade comme ça, ils fuient quoi? C'est vrai, le problème économique qui est aussi lié aux OVD, mais qu'on n'avance pas dans certains pays. On n'arrive pas à atteindre les objectifs du millénium. Mais sur place, il y a aussi des pressions politiques. On parle des droits de l'homme. Il y a aussi des injustices. Il y a des gens qui fuient la dictature. Il y a des gens qui ne sont pas protégés dans leur pays. Maintenant, quand ces gens-là vivent ces choses-là, en ces siècles-ci, mais ils sont obligés d'aller chercher des solutions ailleurs. Or, nous avons beaucoup d'instances qui peuvent décider ou trouver des moyens pour contraindre les pays ou personnes ou en tout cas agir plus que ce qu'il y a maintenant. Parce que ce qu'il y a maintenant, on voit que ça ne donne toujours pas les solutions attendues. Et ce sont des lourdeurs qui font qu'on n'arrive pas à atteindre les objectifs du millénaire. Donc moi je crois on a beaucoup parlé de ces aspects-là, mais maintenant cherchons des vraies solutions pour que ces lourdeurs-là puissent s'amenuiser et qu'on se lance vers un réel développement qui va aussi éviter les inégalités qui sont aussi des causes de migration, des causes de problèmes dans les pays. Je pense qu'il faut passer dans la pratique des choses.
Thank you very much. There was indeed a young gentleman to my left over there, blue shirt.
Merci. Je suis M. Chikonge et je représente le bureau régional pour les questions migratoires dans l'état du Brandenburg en Allemagne. Bon, j'aimerais juste constater qu'il y a de très belles décisions qui sont prises et que nous avons fait 15 ans avant de nous rendre compte que les MDGs n'étaient pas véritablement, je dirais, adaptés à la situation. Qu'est-ce qui est fait pour crédibiliser ces nouveaux, je dirais, objectifs? Par exemple, quand on sait que les grandes entreprises n'arrivent pas à s'approprier elles-mêmes ces objectifs-là, en délocalisant leurs structures dans les pays en voie de développement avec le travail des enfants, qu'est-ce qui est fait pour que ces industries d'armement puissent aussi s'approprier ces objectifs quand on connaît tout ce qui se passe actuellement? Je n'aimerais pas répéter ce que la dame a dit, mais j'aimerais juste que vous qui décidez, vous essayez un peu de nous dire dans quelle mesure vous-même vous appropriez au niveau politique ces objectifs-là. Merci.
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple of more questions before giving members of the panel a chance to reply. Please, the lady on my right.
Bonjour. Je suis Khadija Sangare Koulibaly, je suis la présidente de la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme du Mali. Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier l'Union européenne pour l'organisation de ce forum et les remercier aussi pour nous avoir permis d'être là aujourd'hui, et remercier aussi tous nos partenaires. Maintenant, j'ai une préoccupation. Un intervenant a dit que les institutions nationales des droits de l'homme sont reconnues comme des acteurs clés sur le plan international. Mais sur le plan national, j'avoue qu'il y a un problème. Il y a un problème par rapport à nos autorités qui n'arrivent pas encore à comprendre ce rôle que les INDH peuvent jouer. Si je prends l'exemple de mon pays, ce rôle n'est pas bien compris. Alors, question, qu'est-ce que l'Union européenne peut faire pour amener les autorités à reconnaître l'importance du rôle que les INDH peuvent jouer en matière de promotion et de protection des droits de l'homme, mais aussi pour la mise en œuvre de ces objectifs-là durables pour le développement. Donc c'est ça ma question, parce que le CIC, le président du CIC est là, et il y a des commissions nationales des droits de l'homme qui n'ont pas encore le statut A, qui ne sont pas encore conformes au principe de Paris. Et nous avons beau faire le plaidoyer pour renforcer ce statut, il y a vraiment un problème. Donc nous avons besoin aussi de l'Union européenne et de tous les autres partenaires des États pour qu'ils puissent faire le plaidoyer auprès des autorités pour renforcer le statut des INDH afin qu'elles puissent jouer ce rôle-là. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman right in front. Yes.
Merci beaucoup, madame. Léonard Matalatala, Université de Lorraine, pour répondre un peu aux préoccupations de madame qui a parlé avant. Je vais rejoindre peut-être mon collègue universitaire qui a évoqué tout à l'heure. Je pense que les droits de l'homme souffrent du manque de sanctions, c'est-à-dire en français on dit il faut la carotte et le bâton quelquefois pour que ça marche. Dans les droits de l'homme, on a beaucoup écrit, il y a beaucoup de documents, il y a beaucoup d'institutions comme on a évoqué ici. Mais la seule chose qui manque, c'est effectivement au niveau national, les autorités, compte tenu, si on reste en tout cas dans le cadre des Nations Unies, les Nations Unies fonctionnent avec le principe de la souveraineté nationale. On doit respecter les autorités nationales. Ces autorités-là, tant qu'elles ne voient pas de bâton sur leur tête pour les obliger à respecter les droits de l'homme, on restera à faire nos discours et ça continuera. Est-ce qu'il est possible, ma question aux panélistes et à madame, vous qui êtes à la commission, on sait que dans le cadre de l'Union européenne, la coopération et le développement fonctionnait avec un principe de conditionnalité, mais on sait que ces principes-là, malheureusement, ils ne marchent pas toujours. Est-ce qu'il est possible, au niveau international, qu'on puisse avoir une juridiction spéciale chargée de faire respecter les droits de l'homme, comme on a ici en Europe la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, la Cour de justice pour l'Union européenne, juridiction qui pourrait, différente de la Cour pénale internationale, qui pourrait justement faire en sorte que ces autorités-là nationales, qu'on soit dans un État démocratique ou pas, puissent d'une certaine façon être obligées par vous, les instances des Nations Unies, à respecter tous les organes qui respectent les droits de l'homme sur leur territoire et donc faire en sorte que ce droit-là soit effectivement le droit de chaque homme, chaque individu sur Terre. Merci.
Thank you. One more question and then I have to turn to the panel. Right, okay, the gentleman there, yes.
Thank you so much. I am Hafid Abbas, Commissioner from the National Commission of Human Rights of the Republic of Indonesia. Thank you so much to the EU to organize this very important and historic event. And also to all panelists, your perspective was very insightful. Indonesia is indeed a new democratic country. We just moved from authoritarian regime to democracy last 17 years. We changed our approach to development from centralistic system to the centralized system. So Indonesia with about 80,000 islands, 254 million people is almost equal to EU. And it's not easy to manage it. But we have democratized our system. But there was a dark side of democracy. In my capacity as a commissioner in the National Commission of Human Rights of this country, every single day I receive at least 30 complaints across Indonesia. And the major complaints is only two actors. One is local authority, second is police, and the third is businessman. So those three actors are the violators for human rights. So how to manage local authority? The real implementers for the agenda of SDGs. How to fight with the police, they're very powerful. And how then we change the conspiracy for the local authority with business community. So probably all panelists who I would like to learn more from your perspective that how can Indonesia could manage this dark side of democracy. That's my perception. That in order that we arrive at a strong tradition of democracy and we can properly implement the SDGs agenda. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I will just let Mr. Forest give a reply to some of the questions, followed by one more panel member, please.
Merci bien, Lotte. Je voudrais revenir sur deux points. J'ai indiqué tout à l'heure que je revenais d'une série de consultations régionales commencées au mois d'octobre 2014 pour recueillir le point de vue des organisations de la société civile et des défenseurs des droits de l'homme. Et à l'issue de ces consultations, j'aurais rencontré plus de 500 défenseurs de plus de 110 pays, en essayant particulièrement de viser des défenseurs qui travaillent sur le droit au développement. Et j'ai rencontré effectivement des organisations de paysans qui luttent contre la déforestation, ceux qui travaillent contre les industries extractives, qui viennent écarter, évacuer des populations de leur terrain, ceux qui travaillent au droit au logement et qui luttent contre le fait que pour leur donner le logement, on évacue d'autres personnes de lieux habités par des populations autochtones. J'ai rencontré ceux qui travaillent sur le droit à l'accès à l'eau potable. Et donc ces organisations de défense des droits de l'homme m'ont également passé un message en direction de la Commission. L'une des questions que je leur ai posées, c'est de vérifier avec elles si elles connaissaient les lignes directrices de l'Union européenne sur les défenseurs des droits de l'homme. et si elles étaient invitées par les délégations de l'Union européenne à participer aux réunions annuelles que les délégations organisent avec les défenseurs des droits de l'homme sur la ligne directrice. Et je dois dire que la très grande majorité de ces organisations ne sont jamais invitées à rencontrer les délégations de l'Union européenne, qui en fait ont tendance à inviter d'abord celles qui travaillent sur les droits civils et politiques, mais ces nouvelles catégories de défenseurs ne sont jamais entendues, ne sont pas écoutées, ne sont pas visées par les délégations. Et s'il y a un message que je retiens de ces consultations régionales et qui sera adressé dans mon rapport à la Commission européenne, c'est de privilégier dans les directives de nos délégations de rencontrer ces organisations, ces nouvelles catégories de défenseurs qui travaillent sur le droit au développement et l'accès aux différents droits. Le deuxième point porte sur la question de la conformité des INDH au principe de Paris, et j'ai entendu avec d'autres les critiques faites par Henry du Forum Asie, mais également d'autres, sur le fait que les ONG ne peuvent pas vraiment toujours faire confiance aux institutions. Et c'est vrai que dans le système d'accréditation aux Nations Unies des INDH, il manque un élément fondamental, et c'est bien de l'avoir rappelé ici, et puisque la Commission fait des INDH une des priorités fortes et veut aider les institutions à être plus fortes et plus indépendantes de l'État, je crois que dans le système d'accréditation, il faudrait que la voix de la société civile soit systématiquement entendue, et que la voix des défenseurs soit systématiquement entendue et recherchée au moment où, tous les 4 ans, on fait l'évaluation de la conformité des INDH au principe de Paris. C'est une des propositions que le sous-comité d'accréditation aura à examiner et qui permettrait de faire entendre sans doute la voix de ceux qui ne prennent jamais la parole dès lors qu'on questionne l'effectivité de l'action des INDH dans leur propre pays.
Thank you very much. One last word to Mr. Stefanov, please, if you'd like to intervene before we wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotte. First of all, I felt some concern in the room about the issue of independence of NHRIs. Michelle already touched upon this issue. How can we expect the NHRIs to live up to the expectations for the follow-up to the SDGs if they're not independent enough? It's a very valid question, and I'd like to just very briefly mention the fact that there is a basic international standard as to the independence of the NHRIs, which is called, of course, the Paris Principles, and there is a regular process of review of the compliance of every NHRI which has been accredited with the Paris Principles, and this accreditation and re-accreditation procedure is carried out by the ICC with support from the Office of the High Commissioner. This procedure has